Welcome back to the book club. Today's video is going to be a book discussion on The Butcher's Masquerade by Matt Dinniman. This is book 5 of the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. So if you haven't read the series so far, this book discussion is going to be containing a lot of spoilers about the plot and things that go on. So if you're not caught up on the series, it's probably a good idea to skip this one potentially. I'm just going to be going over, this shouldn't be a very long of a video, but just going to be going over like some of the end of things that happened in book 4, how they set up for book 5, and then generally what I thought about some of the bigger events that happened in book 5. It's been at this point a couple weeks since I finished reading, so I just tried to compile kind of a slideshow with a few of the major things that I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to be going through that. So I'm just going to dive into it right now. All right, here we go. Book discussion on The Butcher's Masquerade. So to start off, the end of book 4, I think specifically the epilogue in book 4 really sets up the very beginning of this book and sort of a plot thread that goes across the entire book. So at the end of book 4, there's a few revelations that we learn that are really why I'm reading the book. I mentioned in one of my earlier book discussion or book review videos on the series that what I like most is about Carl's thinking about how he's going to escape the dungeon or punish the people that have put him into the dungeon and all of this stuff. So his interactions with the outer galaxy are what's really exciting to me. And this prologue in book 4 is really, obviously in book 4, he also killed the handler lady that's not Zev. I forget what her name was, but so he's had some impact on the outside world. But the end of book 4 is when we find out exactly how people from the outside are helping him. So there's Dr. Porthos, who we know as, I believe he was the second owner of the Anarchist Cookbook. So if you were paying attention while reading the cookbook things, they always include the author's name and Dr. Porthos, who was written in the book, and I believe he's the second one to have owned it. And it turns out that he's part of the Open Intellect Pacifist Action Network, which was one of the sponsors of Carl, and I believe they they had to drop him at some point. I don't exactly remember the reasoning at this point. But anyways, we know that this, Dr. Porthos, who is helping out Carl and knows about him and is like paying attention. And we also know that Porthos must have escaped the dungeon because he's now like CEO of this company and is helping Carl. And I would assume that he knows that Carl has the cookbook. I know that like Carl's actively trying to hide the fact that he has it and is not revealing anything, but I have to assume that because he's caught the attention of Dr. Porthos, who I don't remember if like there's any specific formulas that Carl's used that specifically came from things that this guy wrote in the cookbook or not. Like that there may be a more direct connection that I just don't remember off the top of my head, but at least in my brain, I'm assuming that he knows that Carl has the cookbook and maybe that's the reason why he's helping him. Or he's just seen his actions and knows that like this is the action of a guy who the cookbook would go to. Something that's interesting to me about all this as well is I'm hoping at least that the Anarchist Cookbook maybe has like a greater role in all of this. Like maybe it's more than just a way for people to pass down information between various runs of the dungeon, because it's like an item that's given to people through the AI system and stuff, but the AI is like always different for all the dungeons. But for some reason, the Anarchist Cookbook has stuff that is like contained throughout the dungeons. So, it's kind of unclear exactly how that works. But I'm hoping that we eventually learn more about, exactly what the role this Anarchist's Cookbook plays, and how it relates to like the greater universe. Also, I will say I haven't actually read book 6 yet, so it's possible that some of the things I speculate on are answered in book 6. It's something I'll probably be reading within the next month. I just haven't gotten there yet, so I am a little bit behind on the most up-to-date information. The other thing that happens at the end of book 4, actually, this actually comprises more of the epilogue than what I just talked about, is that we learn that B is still alive. There's actually a bunch of people that are still alive that survived the collapse, and B is alive and she gets captured and then gets saved by Odette. And we learned that they're going to be using people from outside the dungeon against them. So this is sort of foreshadowing what ends up happening in book 5, where Ferdinand the cat. I forget what his real name was, but Ferdinand is what Princess Donut calls him. And also Queen Imogen or Imogen, which was Florin's girlfriend's twin. So we learn we can assume that the antagonists in book 5 are going to be people from the real world because that's why they captured Carl's girlfriend or ex-girlfriend in the first place, and that's going to come up. And I kind of assume that this isn't going to be a thing that gets dropped after this book, and I assume that there's going to be future people that they have to kill or fight or whatever that are going to be based on people that they actually know, or the version of them. It's unclear exactly how like Ferdinand got into the dungeon, if it's just the AI copies him and puts him in, or like does he die in real life. I don't exactly know. But I assume that this is going to be a weapon that we're going to see in the future, although presumably we're not going to see some surprise with Bay or B. But also she was saved by Odette, but we also know that it's not exactly clear what Odette's motives are. We know that she had some sort of conflict with I'm now forgetting his name, but Donut's manager guy, who's their their captain, and is teaching them the ropes. She and he went through the dungeon with Odette and in the past, and they had some falling out. So it's not exactly clear what's going on there. Again, it maybe Odette is actually trying to use her for maximum drama and wants to sort of drop B into the hands of the people running the dungeon before some critical moment later on, so that I don't know, there can be even more views or something. But Odette's definitely a drama farmer, so I would not be surprised if Bay is not actually being sent into the galaxy and is safe, and is secretly just a threat that she has to use against Carl at some point in the future. Mordecai is the name I was looking for. It's possible that she tries to get back at Mordecai for some, whatever happened between them in the past. And again, all this is leading up to what happens in the beginning of book 5, which is the interactions with the lawyer. So, we sort of learned that Carl had some intergalactic woes with his use of the Gate of the Feral Gods, and a lot of people were pissed off at him, and he's sort of like cheating the dungeon. And so there's a bunch of lawsuits that happen, and then Carl gets this intergalactic lawyer guy. So I talked about this during my book review, but I think that this was a great premise for foreshadowing. So we sort of hear the first third of the conversation with Carl and his lawyer and like the representative that they were talking with. And then we sort of fade to black and sort of get into the dungeon. And then at certain points throughout the plot, we flash back to what happened with the lawyer. We learn about how the lawyer, sort of gave Carl some tricks to use and how to like get the most out of this situation, this litigation, and figure out how to like sneak things into the dungeon or get things into the dungeon that would be beneficial for him. And so we know that Carl has these plans that we don't have the full information of, and then we get to read the flashback, understand what Carl was planning ahead of time with the lawyer, and then we go back into the action and we see how that plan gets utilized. Things like the I forget what it's called now, like the Zerzura spell or whatever. We know for the entire book that there's some spell that he planned with the lawyer, but we don't know what it does until we eventually flashback. We learn about Carl learning about the spell, and then that sort of goes along with the conclusion where they end up using the spell. And I wrote here again, Carl is greatly successful at his goal of pissing off the Galaxy Corporation. So obviously with Carl's use of the Gate of the Feral Gods, he kind of screwed things up on floor 9. And this book ends with them skipping floor 7 and going to floor 8. So my assumption is that that would mean that book 7 is going to be floor 9, which is when we see sort of the full ramifications of all the shit that Carl's done up to this point. And I have to imagine that in book 6, Carl also does more things to screw up the what's going on floor 9. But basically he keeps like sending things there because that's how he can affect the outside world. And I have to imagine there's going to be some sort of cluster of a situation once he gets there. So one of the big things that happens throughout this book is, I wrote Trouble in Mantis Town. There's this whole drama with these mantises, and they're like one of Carl's primary enemies. I forget what like the the main person's name was, that was against him at this point. But I think that the Mantis people were pretty cool, warriors that put their foes' heads on their back. There's the whole thing where um, when praying mantises make babies, the female kills the male, and I think she beheads him or something. I don't actually know how accurate that is, or if that's how like all praying mantises work, or if it's just like one of those myths that kids talk about on the playground. But it made an appearance here, and so did like super aids, which is what I'm depicting with this amazingly photoshopped image that I have here. I just thought that this was a very fun. This wasn't like the main plot because we sort of all knew it was leading towards the castle and like the drama with Ferdinand and Queen Imogen or Imogen, is what this was building up towards, and obviously the Butcher's Masquerade. But the Mantises obviously had a they were sort of like the main enemy throughout the book, and then towards the very end there was the goddess like Diwa or something, who ended up making a shitload of mantis babies and sending them into the castle and causing all kinds of chaos. So, I mean, overall, I just thought this was pretty fun. It was like an interesting enemy for Carl to have throughout. So, Carl, for a lot of the previous books, was like he was thinking about how to get at the hunters on floor 6 before they got here, and just part of Carl's planning nature is that he really wanted to fuck up the hunters, and so whatever the name of the main mantis person was ended up sort of being enemy number 1 because she was like the primary hunter. He sort of learned that she was the one that had the most backing. She was definitely the strongest of them. And on his hunter killing spree, he just ended up having to clash with her. So I thought it was very fun to, give Carl a new sort of rival like this just for this floor that he could then give some super STD to and then take out later on towards the end of the book, and sort of like be done with them. But it's like yet another sort of empire that gets impacted by Carl. It's no longer just the Prince Maestro guy and his family, but now there's also like these Mantis people that hate him. And he really, screwed up their day and killed their, prized warrior and all of that stuff. And that sort of leads us to what ends up, the ultimate plot conclusion climax of this book, which was the Butcher's Masquerade, also known as the Ballroom Blitz or the Castle Crashers. So I thought this was pretty fun. It was sort of leading up to this. There's this whole storyline with the T-Rex. I'm just going to call them T-Rexes, but like the army of T-Rexes that were sort of following Donut around, and they had to put on this recital for them, and they were sort of using this as part of the plot to figure out how to impact the castle in a way that wouldn't cause them all to die, because they knew that during the Butcher's Masquerade there would be this spell cast where like nobody could attack anybody, or they would disappear into the nothing, I think was the premise there. So they had to sort of figure out how to work around these rules. And I thought the castle overall was kind of set up like, it felt to me like it was like a D&D campaign situation, because the castle, there's even a picture in the book, but the castle had this like layout where there's 5 floors, and the ballrooms for the hunters and the crawlers were on different floors, and there was a control room in the middle, and they were trying to figure out ways to like sneak around the castle or get people from the outside to sneak around the castle and impact things from outside of their like zone that they're allowed in. Also the creatures that were with them were like in a separate zone as well, so they knew that they couldn't directly, the people that they were seeing were like holograms, so they couldn't directly affect them. And I don't know, to me it felt like I don't know exactly what Matt Dinniman's writing style is, but what it felt like is he sort of like set up a campaign mission that he then had to solve himself with the tools that he's given Carl and Princess Donut and all the other people. I have to imagine that there was more planning that went into it like that. Like he didn't just write up to that point and then think of this cool castle thing and then think, how do I solve this with the tools I've been given? But that's sort of what it feels like to me. And I think that's what makes it satisfying. It doesn't necessarily feel like there's any I was gonna say there's not really any Deus Ex Machinas, but like that's kind of what this book is all about. But there wasn't anything that like felt um like forced or unfair necessarily about the way that the characters like hacked the castle and broke the butcher's masquerade, and then ultimately it ended up in like a steel cage deathmatch situation, which I think was also pretty fun, with the like 1v1 battle at the very end, to sort of win and be able to escape the floor alive. I thought that that was all very fun. I definitely was not expecting that the castle would sort of be destroyed and there'd be this 1v1 at the end. But I think that was a very fun way to end it and like an exciting conclusion to all the stuff that was built up. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about like how the castle was set up and how interesting it was, just like how exactly, again, I don't know how Matt um tends to write these things, but to me it really feels like a thing where he could just sort of set himself up and then try to dig into the toolkit that he's given these characters to figure out how he like breaks his own puzzle sort of situation. And last but not least, this is sort of the conclusion to book 5 here, Hacking the Dungeon, aka How to Skip Writing Floor 7. So throughout this book, there's like these random objects that are given to different characters through the benefactor boxes, and it's unclear exactly what they're for. And then even once you get to the Butcher's Masquerade, it's still unclear what they're for. And so like the entire time in the back of my head, at least, I was thinking like, what are all these random objects for? What's the purpose? Um, and ultimately at the very end of the book, we do find out that the random items were all given so that apparently Pony slash Prepon, I don't know how to say his name, Prepotente. I never I pronounce his name in my head as Prepontaine, but that's not right at all. I don't know where I get Prepontaine from. Um, but anyways, Pony, accumulates all these tools and then literally breaks floor 7, and they all just sort of move on to floor 8, which I imagine might lead to more litigation and lawyers in the future. I think the like intergalactic lawyer thing is pretty funny. This time it wasn't necessarily Carl that did it, so I don't know if we'll see it through his eyes again, because it was really Pony that sort of did the breaking of the dungeon this time, quite literally the breaking of the dungeon. But the bright side is it brings us one book closer to ultimately what I think will be very interesting in the ninth floor, which maybe will span multiple books. I don't really know. It's sort of, we don't actually know that much about what's like out there past floor 9. There's a lot of things that are leading up to floor 9 being quite climactic, with there was the item that Donut got very early on that like made it so that she needed to be the leader of the Blood Sultanate or something like that. So like she needs to kill everyone that's part of that. And I don't remember who at this point, but somebody else that they know um has that item as well now, and is like part of this succession of the Blood Sultanate, within line of succession. And so like Donut needs to kill somebody that they know in order for Donut to move on. Obviously in floor 9 there's like all the people from the outside of the universe who are pissed off at Carl, so it's going to be an uphill battle. I wouldn't be surprised again if floor 9 is a multi-book arc instead of what we've had thus far, which is like one book per floor. But again, we early on there was a lot of mention about things that happened in later floors when we heard about like how far along Mordecai got and that kind of thing. But I don't recall that much recently about what really goes on after floor 9, besides like it just gets really bad and it's really hard and there's a lot of big scary things. So I'm kind of curious if floor 9 is where things sort of start to break down and they somehow escape the dungeon, or I don't know, the dungeon changes drastically in order to compensate, because like they're doing all these things to really break the AI. I guess that's another thing I didn't really mention in this PowerPoint. I just thought of it now, which was there's a lot of hints that like the AI is doing things that are very odd. It's like behaving, it's always been odd in many ways, but the character specifically mentioned that the AI is like acting differently in this book, and it's sort of hinting that the AI is maybe not as controllable by the Borant company or whatever the other one is that now controls them, the Volte Corporation, I think. Um, it may not be as under control as they think, and the AI is going to start doing its own thing, and maybe it'll start helping out the crawlers more than it has been, or something, or more than it should, I guess I should say. So I'm really curious to know where all that stuff goes. And I guess the last thing to mention is where book 5 ends up, which is that they sort of pick a region on Earth to go to. And I believe that they ended up picking Florida because they were supposed to pick somewhere else. And I think Donut clicked Florida because she didn't know where the place was. So that's pretty funny. I'm not exactly sure how floor 8 is going to work, but it seemed like they had like they could choose a place on Earth. So it's going to be maybe an Earth like floor. Maybe it's like a scaled down version of Earth that they end up on. But I'm curious to see where that goes. I have a feeling that there's going to be just more and more, outside of the dungeon stuff that's happening, because that seems to be the theme so far. So I'm looking forward to that. I think that's like the really fun stuff in the series. But also just the ever expanding toolkit of random items and things that Carl and Donut have. And like how they're going to be used. I'm still waiting for the basically the nuke that Carl has, Carl's doomsday device. I have to imagine that like on floor 9 or something, there's some way that he ends up using this, because it's sort of just like right now it's kind of like a Chekhov's gun. Um and it's been mentioned in every book since book 2, but he hasn't, like, he knows that he still has it, and Matt knows that he still has it, and we're just sort of waiting for him to use it. I don't think it doesn't feel to me like floor 8's the place, but maybe there will be some situation where it will be. The stakes will be high enough that it should be used. Maybe it's something that he somehow gets out of the dungeon and then he like blows up something in the universe. I don't really know, but looking forward to that. But yeah, I ended up talking for probably 15 minutes longer than I thought I would. Hopefully, Dungeon Crawler Carl fans out there enjoyed this video. There's probably a lot of things that I missed talking about, but I just tried to go over some of the things that I've still remembered a couple weeks after reading the book that are still like stuck in my mind. So it feels to me like those are probably the most important things to mention. Apologies for forgetting all the various character names and stuff. There's a lot of them, so they leave my mind really quickly. But thank you for watching the video. See you next time.